Good morning. I'm Eric Sapanik. I'm here with John Caro. We've been asked to do something a little different from our followers, and a lot of people are saying they love the gold spot, but they wish they could watch a little bit more. So we decided to introduce something that's going to be a little bit more time lengthy, and you can watch as much as you like, but we're going to call this the Gold Spot Overtime.
Eric, we get a lot of questions about the Federal Reserve. We talk about it all the time. And one thing people ask is, how much gold does the Federal Reserve actually own?
Okay, so the Federal Reserve does not actually hold gold itself, but it is the custodian for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And that's where they hold the gold. They hold not only the U.S. Stockpiles, but also some of the foreign entities out there and their reserves as well.
Why do they hold it there? What started that?
We've always had a backing of gold ever since the Bretton Woods Act. So, I mean, that's actually what gave us the title of reserve currency in the beginning. We had the majority of the gold holdings all the way from the creation of the Bretton Woods Act, then all the way till we actually came off the gold standard under Nixon.
The Federal Reserve keeps raising interest rates. How does that affect gold? How does that affect their ability to do things like control the supply chain issues?
Well, the supply chain issues is really a much different animal right now than what we're seeing with them rising interest rates. I mean, the whole point of rising interest rates, you're trying to basically make borrowing more expensive to slow down the economy, because inflation right now is running at, well, we're just shy of 6%. The target spot for the Fed, for the Federal Reserve, where they try to keep inflation where we consider to be a healthy level of inflation, is 2%. So we're nearly triple that right now, which is a very bad sign. And I mean, that's the reason why everyone's feeling this. That supply chain issue has really given multiple problems, one of which is the cost of moving the goods is soaring, because I mean, if you have a ship sitting on outside of Long Beach or something like that, I mean, you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars to do that. So the costs are rising there. But the other real big issue as well is the fact that, then companies also start taking advantage of that as well, and they start bumping up prices to basically increase profits, and then they just blame it on inflation and supply chain issues.
So what it sounds like is the Federal Reserve really doesn't have an effective tool for controlling inflation. They're always playing catch up.
Well, I mean, by nature of the study and the way that the Federal Reserve acts, what they actually do is they only can manipulate marketplaces by either printing money, or they go ahead and they rise inflation rates. But you don't know exactly what that's going to do to the number until it starts going down the road, because everything that they do is based off of analysis of past events and chart analysis and those types of things. That's how they get that. So let me ask you a question. What do you think they're studying right now to try to counterbalance the most increasing number of dollars ever printed in the history of man, and shutting down an economy completely worldwide after the pandemic? I mean, how do you model that?
You don't. They're making it up as they go along. And one of the clues that I see in everything I read is they're always talking about people's expectations about inflation, which is what people think is going to happen in the future, or what they hope is going to happen in the future. They're not dealing with real data.
Okay, so we have rising inflation. We're now raising interest rates. What's starting to happen in the stock market now as you're starting to rise interest rates?
It's starting to go down. People are starting to realize that raising interest rates doesn't help when you have no supply to meet demand.
It definitely doesn't help the stock market, because if you make the money more expensive to borrow, there's less money for these entities to be pushing money into the marketplaces, because the money's almost free at one point in time. So you get to play with the government's money and do it at extremely low interest rates. If you look at the US stock market right now, the asset valuation of that actual marketplace versus what's actually in it, it's not even close. I mean, it's such a balloon that the minute you start taking some of that that air out of it, and that air being the printing of money and lending and all that. I mean, that's the jeopardy I see in rising interest rates right now.
Yeah, well, the runaway creation of money, the rising interest rates are causing people to pull their cash out, and they're sitting on cash, or they're coming to us, but they're not supporting the bubble anymore.
That's the other thing. When they start talking about, say, this whole green push and you're trying to get away from fossil fuels, nothing is made without fossil fuels. Nothing. It's not just about driving vehicles. It's about production. And anything that we produce, consume, everything has some sort of fossil fuel involved in it.
Yeah, and you can see that in the news. Pick any subject. Pick what's going on in Europe with the gas from Russia. All of a sudden, they're talking about shutting down their economies because they don't have access to fossil fuels and they don't have an alternative. It's just the way our money people keep creating money, but there's nothing under it. There's no support, and eventually that's going to come home to roost.
With everything that we're watching right now, you would think perhaps the new monetary policy, if we're rising interest rates, what would be just the other thing that you would consider if you were trying to slow down inflation? What would be the other thing? So they can do two things, right? They can either print money or they can raise interest rates. But they can also
stop government spending.
Exactly. And start pulling off of how much money you're printing. But what's the number one thing that Biden's talking about right now? He wants to
forgive student loans at $1.3 trillion. And he wants to hand out more money. He wants to open the borders. Everything he wants to do requires the creation of more unsupported paper money.
I think the one thing that a lot of people don't understand too is what that student loan money is. That student loan money comes from the U.S. Treasury. That is basically an investment by the taxpayer that's supposed to not only be paid back, but paid back with interest. That's the whole model. So when they say we're just going to forgive $1.3 trillion in student loans, which is second to only mortgages. I mean, it's the largest debt in this country next to mortgages. Now, I mean, we could sit here and debate how in the world we ever let the U.S. public get to a $1.3 trillion student debt, but nonetheless, we acquired it. So this isn't money that, these aren't grants, these are loans. And that is one of the few loans that you can't, even under bankruptcy, you can't escape that. So now instead of putting ourselves to a situation where people can't get out of the loan even under bankruptcy, now we're to the point where we say, no, we're just going to give it away for free. I mean, to me, that's Santa Claus type of politics, and I can't imagine what something like that would do to our inflationary rates, because we're going to pay for it one way or the other. You're going to pay for it through taxation or inflation. It's one of the two. But that money is not going to disappear and everything's fine.
Well, the taxpayer will foot the bill, and in a more subtle way, they will have then taught all those people who owed the money, the students, that it's okay not to pay your debts. And
Well,
so
sure.
we're training a whole generation to not accept responsibility for their acts. And to me, that may be more dangerous than the monetary shenanigans that are going on, because we keep paying for people to not take responsibility. We pay them to stay home. We pay them not to work. We pay them to cross the border. Where does it end?
Do you think the 1.3 trillion will actually be forgiven? Do you think there's any chance?
If the midterms go the way people think they're going to go, no, it won't be forgiven. If the Democrats survive the midterms, they'll pay it off to pay off the voters who voted for them.
What do you do moving forward when the next crop of kids is looking to go to college?
I think we're headed to some very hard times. I think either the next generation or the one after is going to have to bite the bullet and pay for all this, and it's going to be ugly and painful. But I don't see a rational way out of this without some serious financial adjustments in our economy.
Can this work forever?
No. History has shown us that. The difficulty is sometimes the exit for something like this is a war, sometimes it's a depression, sometimes it's both. These things come in cycles because the next generation of politicians doesn't learn from what happened before. And you can see it over and over. And we're seeing it now.
The Federal Reserve is also leaning very left. Take a guess at how many Democrats versus Republicans are working for the Federal Reserve right now.
I don't have to guess, you told me that. It's like 9-1.
It's actually 10.4 to 1.
10.4 to 1. Remember, our Treasury Secretary considers debt an asset. She actually said that. She didn't explain it, but she said it.
After the Bretton Woods Act, after we came off the gold standard, a lot of people don't know this, but one thing that we did is we shook hands with Saudi Arabia, making sure that they would trade nothing but US dollars in order to buy petro. Now, fast forward to today, this has worked for us for quite some time because it really helped us dominate the world when it came to international currency exchange. So we were always the reserve currency, even in a fiat-based money system. What if all of a sudden we did see China become, or the yuan become the new exchangeable currency for the US dollar? How do you think that would impact the reserve currency status of the dollar?
Well, I think we're heading towards that level of chaos. I don't know how fast, but if you remember recently, Russia and China both announced they wanted their currency to be gold-backed at some point. They're starting to be more aggressive. Saudi is perfectly capable of switching horses in midstream if they don't like the way they're treated. We have not created a system that's flexible enough, in my opinion. We're stuck with what we're stuck with. I don't know where it's going to end up. I don't think anyone does. Certainly Jerome Powell doesn't know. And it's something to worry about.
So if you look at the late 70s and the early 80s, think about this. The amount of American-made products then versus today. That's definitely, I mean, when Nixon took us off of the gold standard, the one thing that the Nixon shock, the one thing that he said was that us not being tied to a gold standard would never affect you, really, as long as you were a part of, and I'll quote him on this one, the overwhelming majority of Americans that buy American products. That was what was supposed to make us feel comfortable walking into a fiat currency. Now, fast forward to today, how many things are made in America? And I honestly think that that is one of the major factors that we need to consider, that we are not in control of our own production. And that is something that's a wild card when you're talking about currency, especially if all of a sudden China decides to, invade Taiwan. What are we gonna do? Put sanctions against them? We can't get an aspirin without them.
Well, you see that going on in Europe now. They're reluctant to deal with Russia because they don't want to lose their gas and oil supplies. Same thing.
They really don't have a choice. I mean, even during the Second World War, they still dealt with them for trade.
There's going to be changes.
I agree.
And there's going to be pain to get rid of this inflation, and there's going to be a continued flight to gold.
I would agree. I believe this is the beginning stages of what we're seeing. I mean, we're only about a year, like I said, a year and one quarter into this current administration. And I mean, I just don't see any different direction in policy other than trying to accelerate how much we're willing to give out for free. And I just don't see how that ends well. Hopefully our commentary here, our little questionnaire, I mean, this is kind of what we do on a day-to-day anyway. We talk about these types of economic issues and politics, I mean, every single day. So we figured instead of just talk about it privately, that we'd do it in front of all of you. And if you found that interesting, check out the next time we do a Gold Spot Overtime. And thank you very much, John. You all have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time.